Mr. Bonney here with another biology lesson, this time on anaerobic respiration. So let's first just take a step back and remember what happens in aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration is really broken up into three processes here, and it starts in the cytoplasm with glycolysis, which is the process that takes glucose and essentially breaks it apart into two pyruvic acids or to two pyruvates. That process does create a little bit of ATP. 2 ATP is what it creates. The pyruvate then moves into the mitochondria as long as there's oxygen present. The oxygen over here, we need that oxygen present in order for these next two steps to happen. So the Krebs cycle then processes that pyruvate and releases some carbon dioxide and also creates some other chemicals that then move over to the electron transport chain. And this is where oxygen is actually used, is here in the electron transport chain. And this process then makes a whole lot of ATP, of about approximately 36 ATP gets made through the electron transport chain, and then some water is made as a byproduct as well. But this process here is aerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration is what happens when this oxygen isn't here. And so then the next question comes, okay, well, if oxygen's not there, what types of organisms can even do this? Well, the first and easiest answer is yeast. And yeast is a type of fungi. It's a single-celled fungus, so it's in the same category of organisms you'd find mushrooms and mold. Here's a microscopic image of it. It's a single-celled organism, and it's eukaryotic. And there's at the bottom is a spoonful of yeast, like what we would use for baker's yeast. Now, yeast does a process that we call alcohol fermentation when there's no oxygen present. Yeast would prefer to do regular aerobic respiration where it uses oxygen, but if there is no oxygen present, it can still survive and do alcohol fermentation. More on that in a minute. There's other types of bacteria that can also do this same type of fermentation as well. And then another place that we find this anaerobic respiration taking place is in our muscle cells. Specifically in response to low or no oxygen environments, our muscle cells can do something called lactic acid fermentation, which processes glucose just like we did before, but doesn't use oxygen, and it makes lactic acid as a byproduct. In fact, let's start there with lactic acid fermentation. This diagram is showing what's happening for the whole overall process for lactic acid fermentation. We start over here with glycolysis. So the beginning portion is exactly as the same as we saw in aerobic respiration, and it makes a little bit of ATP. The process of glycolysis produces pyruvate, and now from here is where the difference comes into play. In lactic acid fermentation, since there's no oxygen available, that pyruvate is going to be converted into something else. In this case, it's going to be converted into lactate, which is the same thing as lactic acid. What's unique here is that lactic acid, once it builds up inside of the muscles, can start to cause the muscles to not operate as well. It creates a little bit of a burning sensation. So less ATP is made, and the byproducts are a little bit more difficult to deal with. So why would the cells bother about doing lactic acid fermentation at all? Well, in certain situations, you might not be getting enough oxygen to your muscles. That could be like extreme exercise or something like that. And if you need to keep moving, you need to keep producing ATP. And so as long as we have glucose available to burn, we can still make small amounts of ATP. It's a lot less than aerobic respiration, but it still allows for energy to be made. We just have to then deal with the byproducts that are made, which in this case are lactic acid. So oftentimes after a stressful workout, like we see this guy here, our lactic acid will build up in high amounts, and then we have to deal with it afterwards. Another situation where we'll see some effects of lactic acid fermentation is that with bad breath. Inside of your mouth, you've got bacteria that's there constantly. Anytime you eat, it gets replenished. It's constantly a source of bacteria there. Especially at night when you close your mouth to sleep, what you can create is an anaerobic environment inside of your mouth, because if you're not breathing through it, then you're not getting a replenishment of the oxygen that's in there, and the bacteria that's naturally growing inside of your mouth will use up all of the oxygen that's there, and then you've created an anaerobic environment. So if there's any food left on your teeth from the day before, the bacteria will eat that food and then therefore produce some, well, smelly byproducts. This also can lead to the creation of cavities as well. Alcohol fermentation is the other type of anaerobic respiration that we're going to talk about. And again, this happens in yeast. The process to start is exactly the same. Here's glycolysis right here. We're taking glucose and we're splitting glucose up and we're making a little bit of ATP and then we generate 2-pyruvates. And again, now here is where the difference is. Like I said before, yeast would prefer to do aerobic respiration, but in this process right now, there is no oxygen present. So instead of converting the pyruvate into carbon dioxide and water, it's going to do a different process. And this one will then still create carbon dioxide like we saw before, but it's also now going to produce a separate byproduct. And that separate byproduct is ethanol. Ethanol is ethyl alcohol, or, well, just alcohol. This is the major component that we find in things like beer and wine that are the alcohol component of it. So yeast can still process glucose when there's not oxygen present. It just does this instead. So we kind of take advantage of this, right? And we use this to our favor. We add yeast into beer and wine to ferment them so that they'll produce amounts of alcohol inside of them. This image here shows the process of how it works, essentially. So in this beaker over here on the right-hand side, you have in it some water and some sugar, and then some yeast are added to it. At the top, you have this red stopper and then what's called an airlock at the top. The airlock allows carbon dioxide as it builds up in high amounts to escape out, but it does not allow for new things to make their way back in. So no new oxygen can come back in. So this keeps this environment completely anaerobic where there is no oxygen inside of it. This is exactly how beer and wine are fermented. What will eventually happen, though, is the yeast inside of it will convert enough of the sugar over into alcohol where the yeast can no longer survive. There's just too much alcohol inside of the container. And again, the yeast doesn't want to do this. It would prefer to have oxygen so that it can do the normal process of creating carbon dioxide and water and make a lot more ATP, but it can do this as a reserve should there not be any oxygen available. This last slide here kind of summarizes the whole process. Again, we always start with glycolysis. No matter if you're doing aerobic or anaerobic respiration, happens in the cytoplasm. So right where you've got glycolysis happening and a little bit of ATP is made, and then pyruvate is made. And then we have a choice. If there's oxygen available, we then go into the mitochondria, and then we make way more ATP, up to 36. If there's no oxygen present, that's when we move over into the alcohol fermentation, or then over into the lactic acid fermentation. End of the day here, really the goal in neither of these is to make ATP. It's just how much is going to get made is dependent on whether or not we've got oxygen present. And as you can see, having oxygen present is definitely the way to go. You can make substantially more ATP.